His strategy on Ukraine is probably to call President Zelensky on day one and say, look, we're cutting off support. You've got 2 weeks to work out a deal with President Putin and have them work it out. But make it very clear that the United States is going to dial back its support and will no longer support the war effort there.
So, as we've been hearing, Donald Trump seems to be on course to win the Republican nomination, and polls suggest he could beat Joe Biden. So what would another Trump term in office look like? Lewis Lukens is a former US ambassador to the UK and was in that role when Donald Trump won the presidency in 2020. He's now senior partner with Signum Global Advisors, and I asked him what we should expect from a second Trump presidency.
A second Trump administration in some ways will be less chaotic and more organized than his first administration. You'll remember that he didn't even expect to win last time around. But this time, there is a whole Republican establishment that is creating the building blocks for a new Trump administration that'll be much more disciplined on the personnel and the policy side. So I think domestically, we can expect tax cuts or a push for tax cuts and deregulation, more drilling of oil, rolling back environmental laws, environmental protection laws. And internationally, I think we can expect what we saw the first time around with Trump, which is sort of snubbing his nose at traditional allies, not wanting to work within alliances, and very much of an America first, America alone foreign policy.
Having seen Donald Trump when he first went into the White House, how much of a shock to the entire Washington system, let alone relations with the rest of the world, was it?
Well, it was a huge shock, and partly because he was so unpredictable and really so ill-prepared to be president. I think this time around, there are a lot of people in government who are crossing their fingers, hoping it doesn't happen again, and worried about action. He has threatened to fire scores and scores of civil servants and career government employees and to replace them with people who are tried and tested loyalists to him and his agenda. So I think there's a lot of trepidation on the part of the bureaucracy in Washington about what a Trump administration may look like.
And we've had Donald Trump himself joking that, well, he'd only be a dictator on day one, and that that would enable him to try to ensure that there's more drilling for oil, for example. How much of a joke do you think that was?
Well, I don't think it's much of a joke. I mean, I think Donald Trump is clearly driven by personal grievances and will want to extract revenge against people that he sees as his opponents. I think there may be a check. I mean, I think in the elections in November, chances are that Democrats will take control of the House of Representatives. So there will be a bit of a check and balance there. But I think we can expect President Trump to use every lever of the administrative branch of government, the executive branch of government, to push his agenda and to go after people who he thinks are standing in his way.
And you mentioned relations with other countries. We know that when Trump was in power before, he had a very difficult relationship with Theresa May. And amongst the concerns of many politicians in the UK is Trump's attitude to NATO, because he has threatened to pull the US out of NATO altogether. Do you think he'd actually do that?
Well, the Senate actually passed a law last month which says that the president cannot unilaterally pull out of NATO, that Congress would have to approve. So he won't be able to pull out of NATO. But what he can do, at least in a formal way, but what he can do is signal to the world that the U.S. won't live up to its NATO commitments. And he will also, I'm sure, continue what he did for 4 years, which is harangue NATO members to pay more for their defense. So I think it'll be, if he is reelected, it'll be an uncomfortable time for NATO, and I think send a signal to the rest of the world that the United States is not prepared to live up to its previously agreed commitments.
And what about Ukraine? He's talked about very swiftly resolving the war there, but it's far from clear whether his idea of resolving the war would be remotely acceptable to the Ukrainians.
Well, I think his strategy on Ukraine is probably to call President Zelensky on day one and say, look, we're cutting off support. You've got 2 weeks to work out a deal with President Putin and have them work it out. But make it very clear that the United States is going to dial back its support and will no longer support the war effort there.
The relationship between the US and the UK is, of course, known as the special relationship. How do you think that relationship would work? Of course, a lot depends on what sort of government we have in power here in the UK, because we're likely to be having an election at the same time as the United States.
Well, exactly. And we could see, a switch on the U.S. side from Democrats to Republicans, and on this side from conservative to Labor. And I think that would be a very interesting and possibly challenging dynamic, because I don't think that the opposition leader here and President Trump probably agree on much when it comes to policies and international relations. At the end of the day, the relationship is special for a reason, and that is the sort of the consistency and the professionalism of the civil servants and bureaucrats on both sides of the Atlantic, who work together extremely well on intelligence and defense and trade and other issues. Now, as I said, Donald Trump is intending to get rid of a broad swath of career people, so it may make maintaining that relationship a little bit more difficult. But at the end of the day, the U.S.-UK relationship has survived difficult relationships between presidents and prime ministers before.
And one of the other issues where there is very likely to be very big differences would be on the green agenda, particularly if we have a Labour government in the UK that's committed to a big programme of investment in clean, green technology. Donald Trump has already said that he'd pull out of the Paris Accords.
Yeah, I'm sure he'll pull out again. And I think he will. He's already indicated that he will make a big effort to roll back a lot of the environmental protection laws that the Biden administration has put into place. The Biden administration has also worked with Democrats and some Republicans in Congress to pass laws that provide lots of financial incentives to boost the sort of the green technology, solar power, wind power, electric vehicles, things like that in the United States. There are many Republicans who don't like those laws and will work, I think, with Donald Trump to try to roll some of them back.
We're talking about what a potential Trump presidency Mark II might look like. But when we look at the result from Iowa, that is, of course, just the start of the voting process for choosing the Republican nominee. I mean, there is quite a long way to go between now and November. How likely do you think it is, as someone who watches the political scene so closely in the United States, that Trump will emerge as the winner?
Well, you know what, Carol, honestly, I think we'll know by the end of next week. The next contest is in New Hampshire next Tuesday, which is a more traditional primary than what we saw in Iowa last night. But if Nikki Haley does not do very well in New Hampshire next week, I think the race is almost over. I think Donald Trump will steamroll his way through the rest of the contest, and certainly by early March. Super Tuesday is March 5th, after which, more than a third of the delegates will be assigned. I think we'll know by then that Donald Trump is the nominee. And then it becomes a two-person race very, very early, and basically from March until November.
And of course, that election campaign, the presidential one, if it does become Trump v. Biden once again, something that most American voters would rather not see, it will be quite different, won't it? Because, of course, last time around, we were still living through the pandemic, and that really made a difference to the sorts of events that could take place.
Yes. And Joe Biden, if you look at him speaking or moving in public, I mean, his age very much shows. And I think that is a bit of a liability for him. Many Americans have said that they think he's too old and he shouldn't run again. Donald Trump is not much younger, but he sort of appears more vibrant when he's on stage. And it'll be interesting to see if the two men even agree to debate each other. I mean, there's always a series of presidential debates leading up to an election. Donald Trump hasn't participated in any of the Republican debates so far this cycle. Will he agree to debate President Biden? We'll see. I mean, I think there are many ways this could be a very unusual cycle.
And we heard Donald Trump talking in conciliatory terms about how he hoped people could come together. But, I mean, America is a very divided society. And do you think that the coming months between now and the presidential vote in November, we are going to see those divisions exposed again?
We are. I mean, Donald Trump, you're right. I mean, he sort of made a half-hearted attempt to be conciliatory last night and praised his opponents and wanted people to come together. At the same time, in the next breath, he said that Joe Biden was the worst president ever in American history, that the 2020 election was stolen from him, Trump. So, it's like people tell him you have to be presidential and conciliatory and start moving to the middle to attract swing voters. And he gets up on stage, and that's what's written on his teleprompter. And so he reads that, but then his worst instincts get the better of him, and he goes off on these riffs, attacking people and complaining about the last election. So I think we're going to see two sides of Donald Trump in the coming months: the sort of on-message Donald Trump mixed in with the sort of angry, ranting Donald Trump.
Lewis Lukens, former US ambassador to the UK, now a senior partner with Signum Global Advisors, speaking to me just a little earlier.